Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you this evening?
Hey, pretty good, Jeff. I gave you a little disclaimer before we started recording that I'm dealing with some allergies, so I'm going to have to deal with sounding very nasally today.
Not a problem.
But I picked a topic here dealing with waterbeds. It was a call that we received kind of randomly a couple of weeks ago, and I ended up speaking to the landlord and just had some general questions on what they should do if the tenant wants to bring a waterbed into the property. And the landlord had some obvious concerns about having a waterbed. So, believe it or not, there's an actual waterbed addendum. As we know, there's usually addendums and documentation for every situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the waterbed addendum covers a lot of things if you are a landlord considering allowing a waterbed. The first thing that popped into my mind was, do people actually still sleep on waterbeds?
I know. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. I don't even know where you would buy one anymore, but I guess if you had one and maybe you've always liked it, but I just went mattress shopping not too long ago, and waterbeds were not an option anymore.
No.
So, but like I said, apparently people do still have waterbeds, and so it's definitely an issue that's floating around there. And um, I think the biggest key for the landlord to keep in mind is the addendum and any kind of, if you are considering allowing them to have one. Um, Everything's going to be to protect you from the worst case scenario. Obviously, the waterbed breaks, and now you got significant water, issues in whatever room and below that room, most likely of wherever that waterbed is. So if it's a second floor situation, um, I could see a landlord just flat out banning it, saying, no, this is, too big of a risk, too big of a problem. The weight, the water, if something does happen, now we've got to deal with two units um, versus just the one. So, I could see a lot of landlords just flat out saying, no, we're not going to do it. But if you are going to do it, the addendum covers some pretty basic things. Not only the type of waterbed that it is, I'm completely unaware of this. So I'm reading this off of our waterbed addendum that's available in the landlord form bundle on rentprep.com. But apparently, the waterbed needs to consist of a mattress at least 20 milliliters or millimeters thick with lap seams and a safety liner at least 8 millimeters thick, and a sturdy frame enclosure that meets Waterbed Manufacturer Association standards, and an optional heater. So I would imagine that they're just basically saying it needs to be a legitimate waterbed that's up to standards. I don't know if
I
people
would
are
think so. Yeah. I would expect if you can actually buy a waterbed, it's probably going to meet those standards.
right, unless you're dealing with like a home. Maybe people make homemade waterbeds
That
and
could be.
they
Yeah,
want
the
to
whole
deter that.
DIY movement. Maybe they're making their own waterbeds.
Right. You want to avoid that for sure, I would think. Um, but I think the biggest thing on this addendum that I would point out is the tenant has to provide a landlord with a copy of a valid liability insurance policy for at least $100,000, covering specifically mentioning the waterbed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's obviously a very good idea. If you're going to have one, make sure that you're carrying a policy on your renter's insurance, and you let them know that you have a waterbed and specifically name that in the policy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, and you're dealing with in these days, a rather unusual situation if someone actually wanted to have a waterbed, and it makes a lot of sense to protect yourself because that's a lot of water, and the amount
Yeah,
of damage that it can create is pretty significant.
right.
And so, if you're going to allow it, you might as well protect yourself.
Yeah, and I was I guess just to sort of cover a broader base as well. When I was researching for um, this seemed to kind of be lumped into a lot of times the same category as fish tanks because of the
Oh,
water
sure.
situation.
Okay.
So We don't have a fish tank addendum. I can't say I've ever seen one. I think that probably they would most likely fall under pet addendums, but I don't think that's a bad idea. Also, if you're dealing, especially if somebody's got like I've seen some fish tanks that are huge.
Yes.
So if somebody's got a huge fish tank, again, I don't think it's out of the question to say, hey, listen, I want proof that your insurance company knows about this and they're going to cover you in the event that something happens, and that way it leaves the landlord out of the responsibility of fixing something happening, or God forbid that fish tank breaks and you got to deal with a couple hundred gallons of water that now just spilled out into the room.
Hmm.
So I think you know the waterbed addendum could easily be changed to specifically talk about fish tanks. And if you've got a no pet policy and you have somebody who's coming in with a big fish tank or something, again, I would add some very, very specific language in there to address that fish tank and what your expectations are, and what happens in the event that something does go wrong. Even in the waterbed addendum, it says, all damages or losses resulting from the use of the waterbed will be paid within 10 days of receiving a bill. Um, some landlords would argue whether that does you any good or not, but
Right.
at least they're signing off and agreeing to that. And, God forbid it does end up going to a court situation or anything like that. I mean, you've got yourself covered from pretty much every angle.
Yes. And if you've got the insurance addendum, you should be in pretty reasonable shape.
Right.
Yeah, insurance doesn't pay on every claim, but I would expect that in the situation of a fish tank or a waterbed, if it was specifically covered in an addendum and something happens and that water ends up all over your floor, I would think the insurance companies will pay it more often than not. And as you said at the beginning of this, the biggest thing about both of these issues is protecting yourself as a landlord, as a property owner. You don't want to have this potential disaster sitting there that's going to end up costing you money to repair it, and then you could end up with a vacancy after
Right.
you kick that tenant out for not paying you for the repairs, and then you're dealing with having to rent it out and cover the costs in the meantime.
And another point that just sort of occurred to me is, we talk a lot of times about that annual inspection and keeping up with what's happening inside of your unit and what's happening with your tenants. Never a bad idea to keep current with their insurance policies.
Yes.
Let them know ahead of time when you come out to do the annual inspection. You're also going to be reviewing current copies of their insurance policy just to make sure it hasn't lapsed. I mean, in a year's time, they could have stopped paying it, and now they don't have insurance. And you as the landlord would have no idea and no way of knowing that they're not covered anymore.
That's right.
So definitely a good idea to add that to it as well. On an annual basis or biannual basis, just to double check, make sure, hey, you're still carrying all the policies you're supposed to and as agreed. But yeah, who'd have thought waterbed's still
I
around?
know. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, somebody out there's got them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten the phone call. But if you do need one, again, an addendum, exists. It's out there. So just cover yourself, protect yourself as a landlord.
Sounds good. Well, great, Stephen. I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.